All right, I think we can get started. We still have some people arriving, but I think we should get started. Welcome everybody to our talk on emotional responses to the climate crisis, anxiety, anger, and action. My name is Fernando. I'll be one of your moderators today, together with Luisa Nielsen, who will be the other moderator. Luisa, are you, maybe you can show your face? Maybe she's busy at the moment. Okay, before I start, I should say that we will be recording this, this talk. This event is organized together by the Globe Sustainability Initiative and the Sustainability Science Center at the University of Copenhagen. And it was prompted by discussions we were having about how one of the biggest challenges faced with the climate crisis is how to emotionally cope with it and its magnitude. And we wanted to encourage some discussion about this and representing voices from different scientific disciplines that represent different dimensions of the crisis. There's Lisa. We have three wonderful speakers today. First, we have Zoey Leviston, who's a social and environmental psychologist at the Australian National University in Canberra. Her research focuses on the public's response to climate change and pro-environmental behavior. And among other things, she's investigating how social identity, personality traits, and beliefs about behavior influence how we process information about climate change. We also have Katherine Richardson from our very own Globe Institute. She's a professor of biological oceanography and the head of the Sustainability Science Center at the University of Copenhagen. She's a member of a ton of different national and international research committees on climate change and its impacts. And she's also a member of the Danish Climate Council and one of the drafters of the UN Global Sustainable Development Report in 2019. Finally, Lars Turner is a political theorist with a focus on democratic theory and climate change. He's a professor at the Department of Political Science and the Center for Sustainability and Society, here also at the University of Copenhagen. His current research involves analyzing political norms in the Anthropocene, as well as democracy, civil society, and Denmark's role in climate citizenship. Each of the speakers will have 15 minutes to speak about the topic, after which we'll open the floor for a debate that will hopefully be enriched by questions from the audience, but moderated by Luisa and me. And so without further ado, I think we can start. And I think the first one was Zoey in our program. Luisa, correct me if I'm wrong.
You are absolutely correct. But before then, I just quickly wanted to highlight that everyone attending here will join without being muted. So if you could please mute yourselves, that would be great. And also keep in mind that this is recorded and we hope very much that no one has an issue with it. Otherwise, please send a chat or something.
So Zoey, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Okay, so hopefully you can all see that. I'm just going to move that over there. So hello everyone, my name's Zoey. So I'm a psychological researcher at the Australian National University, ANU, and thanks very much for inviting me to this event. So I'm presenting to you from Canberra today in Australia. So Canberra's home to the Ngunnawal people, who I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to, past and present, especially today, which is known as Reconciliation Day here in Canberra. So I'm just going to touch on how this event was described. So the question of why we might feel anxious or angry about climate change was mentioned in the descriptor. So, well, my really trite answer to that is because we should. So it's logical. It's a rational response to the best scientific evidence and projections that are available to us. So to some extent, from a psychological point of view, the rationality of this response makes managing our responses a bit tricky. CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, for instance, relies on pinpointing irrational cognitive distortions in our thinking in order to make us feel better. So dealing with a response that's rational presents a bit of a conundrum. Another thing to consider is we know from research that the types of images that we implicitly think about when we hear the words climate change, they're really overwhelmingly negative, of course. And just avoiding the words climate change is becoming increasingly difficult in everyday life. Having said that, it is true that some people feel more intensely negative about climate change than others. So how might we explain that? So one obvious way is through direct impacts. So if we're directly impacted, of course, we're more likely to feel intense emotions like anxiety. But I think another way that we can think about this is by thinking about something called objects of care. So climate change impacts things that we care about. So that might be impacts to particular groups of people or particular places. It might be to future generations, certain non-human animals. But those objects of care are the link between climate change as something distant, abstract and amorphous and our emotions. So when we see the impacts of climate change on things we value, this bridges the psychological distance between climate change and the self. Personally, I think it's just a matter of time before all of us make that connection. So to me, the question is not so much why do we feel bad? Why do we feel sad? Why do we feel these negative emotions? But rather, is feeling bad always counterproductive? So the first point I'd like to note is we often make the mistake of thinking that all negative emotions are the same. But psychologically speaking, different negative emotions are different in important ways because they have different consequences for what we do and for how we feel in general. So what I'm showing you there is something called an emotion circumplex. And this is one way in psychology of organizing how different emotions are related to one another. So this perspective proposes that emotions can be understood in terms of where they fall along two different spectrums. So first, we've just got an unpleasant to pleasant spectrum across the x-axis here. So everything to the left comprises what we could call negative emotions. And then we also have along the y-axis what's called the degree of activation of emotion. It's sometimes called the degree of arousal. So generally speaking, low activating emotions don't make you want to do anything. So if you feel fatigued or lethargic, your first inclination is to do nothing, really. But high activation emotions make you want to do something. They're activated. So unsurprisingly, most popular climate change imagery sits in the negative high activation quadrant. So this is from research where we asked people to rate how climate imagery makes them feel, and we use that emotion circumplex in this instance. So what this tells us is that what we implicitly associate with climate change makes us first feel bad, and second, it activates us. It makes us want to do something. But what we decide to do depends on the particular emotion that we're feeling. So when we're experiencing a negative activating emotion like fear, anger, anxiety, or distress, there's usually some sort of threat involved. So there's usually an object of threat that's causing that emotion. And depending on the particular emotion, we're inclined to either approach the threat or to actively avoid the threat. We can think of this in the more popular parlance as similar to that fight or flight response. So a fight response means we're inclined to approach the object to make the object less threatening, whereas a flight response means we actively run away to avoid the threat. So in the last 10 years or so, we've seen a lot of research on these high activating emotions in relation to climate change. I think most notably in the last couple of years, so-called climate anxiety. But the results in the empirical research on how climate anxiety relates to well-being outcomes and climate action is quite mixed. So you can have one study that says being highly anxious or scared about climate change is a bad thing. And then the next study will say it actually promotes climate action. So it's good from a collective standpoint. But the idea that fear and anxiety promotes action in an approach sense doesn't make sense psychologically. Anxiety especially is typically an avoid emotion. So feeling hyper anxious about a threat object should prompt you to avoid the threat in the same way that depressive emotions should prompt you just to disengage. So we were really curious about these findings that anxiety promotes action in the climate space. I'll just acknowledge my colleagues here, who you can see listed there. What we did was to look at 3 eco-emotions in particular. So emotions in response to climate change. climate relevant emotions. So we labeled those eco-depression, eco-anxiety, and eco-anger, and looked at how expressions of these emotions were related to both pro-environmental behaviour as well as general wellbeing outcomes. So this is with a group of about 5,000 Australians that we did this study on. So an important difference, sorry, it was a subset of those 5,000 Australians, but an important difference in our study than most of the others in the psychology space is that we don't think that having feelings like eco-anxiety or eco-anger occurs in a vacuum. Instead, we think they're frequently felt together. You know, they're messy and squished together. So if you feel one negative emotion about climate change, you're much more likely to experience another but different negative emotion about climate change. So our goal here was to separate out the unique influence of each of those different negative emotions by controlling for the fact that they do often co-occur. So what do we find? I'm going to throw some yucky schematics at you, but in relation to general mental wellbeing outcomes, we use something called the DAS-21, which measures general levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. And so when we modelled our results, we can see that eco-anger is strongly and significantly associated with reduced levels of general depression, anxiety, and stress when controlling for those other emotions. Eco-anxiety, by contrast, is associated with higher levels of general anxiety and stress. Now, as an individual health outcome, from this we could surmise that eco-anxiety is a bad thing, as is eco-depression, but eco-anger seems to have some sort of protective effect to well-being. So that's, it's really interesting and it's really positive from an individual perspective. But what about an ecological perspective? Does it really help us at all environmentally if we just feel a little bit better if we're angry? Well, what we did also is we measured people's climate relevant behaviour. So that was both in terms of their individual behaviours, so things that they were doing to reduce their carbon footprint, and in terms of collective action. So joining a protest, engaging on social media, trying to convince friends and family members about the importance of climate change. And we can see here that eco-anxiety, it's unrelated to individual behaviour, but negatively predicts collective action. Just like we'd expect theoretically, anxiety prompting avoidance. On the other hand, eco-anger predicts more engagement in both individual and collective action. So not only does this seem useful for mental well-being, but appears to be helpful societally, if you would agree with me that collective action is one of the best tools at our disposal to affect meaningful system change. As for eco-depression, we found it had no relationship with individual action, but a positive relationship with collective action, albeit a pretty weak one. We're still trying to make perfect sense out of that for what should be a disengaging emotion, aside from falling back on some quite old research that misery does indeed love company. So anger has a unique dual benefit, these findings would suggest. So not only does it appear to be related to positive general wellbeing outcomes, it also promotes collective action. And we think the second point might be related to that first point. So we know from work done during the civil rights era that engaging in protest collectively had an empowering effect on people. And there is also some recent research in the climate space that being around like-minded people has a similar empowerment effect and might have dampening effects on anxiety and depression and so forth. So one take-home message might be get mad, stay mad, and accept that other negative emotions are always going to be there, but keep them in check. It's an easy thing to say, right? Just keep them in check. Now, because I'm not a clinical psychologist, I can't provide much individual guidance here about how to keep them in check. But as a social psychological researcher, I can point out a few blind spots we have about each other that I think exacerbate our feelings of climate anxiety and climate depression. So I'm happy to talk about these more later, but just really briefly for now, what do we know about some of these blind spots? So first off, we think we're better than average when it comes to acting on the environment. So we've found in some of the previous studies I've been involved in that most of us tend to overestimate our pro-environmental behaviour relative to others. We think we do more than others. Put another way, and I think maybe this is a more accurate way to think about this better than average effect, is we tend to devalue or ignore or not notice the efforts of others. So there's nothing new about the better than average phenomenon. It occurs in a whole variety of contexts, but it can have the effect of making us think that we're doing all the heavy lifting ourselves. So it's something to be aware of, I think. Second point, and quite related to this, we think we care more about the environment than others. Or again, put another way, we tend to devalue the extent to which others care about climate change and environmental issues. There's one really important caveat to this effect, and that is that ethnic minorities, this is in the US, this study, is that ethnic, although we have replicated it in Australia, is that ethnic minorities and working class groups tend to think their groups care the least about the environment than they actually care the most. So this is something called the environmental belief paradox. So we can see how the climate crisis intersects with these group relations that we have in society as well. Side point, we also tend to think, at least here in Australia, that climate denial is far more prevalent in the community than it actually is. And so this also has the effect of making us think we're doing all the emotional heavy lifting along with all the behavioural heavy lifting as well. And just a last point, those who feel most antagonistic toward climate change action are often people who view themselves as environmentalists, or at least as sympathisers to the environmental cause. And that's thought to stem from a threat to one's social identity. So if participants in climate movements are perceived to be fringe actors, rightly or wrongly, usually wrongly, then this creates a push factor for people who think they're environmental, but they don't want to stray too far from the mainstream. So that's why normalising collective protest is so effective and so important, because it becomes harder for the mainstream to deny that identity overlap. So I'll finish up now just with three main messages. Get mad together, get mad collectively, and don't get too mad with your neighbour, because they might be doing more than you're giving them credit for. So that's it for me at the moment, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Everyone feel free to unmute and clap. It's always so awkward when you're on Zoom and you can't do it. Yay! I really enjoyed your presentation a lot. I'm sure everyone did as well. I don't know if you, Fernando, will introduce Lars, or if I should.
Yeah, I've already introduced him, but I think he's up next. So we can just give him the word. Lars, if you're there.
I'm here, thanks. And let me just share my screen as well.
And as just before you start, as I said in the chat, if you guys have any questions, we're gonna save the questions after all the speakers have had a chance to chat. Feel free to write them on the chat, or just write an X if you'd like to ask the question personally yourself to any of the speakers. Thanks, Lars.
Thanks, and yeah, thanks for the invitation. I think it's a very important topic, and it's a difficult topic, and it's one that we probably need to think more carefully about in the years to come. So as Fernando said, I'm a political scientist. I'm trained as a political theorist. So I come out of a background that's a bit more philosophical than it is empirical, although I am also interested in how things actually work out in the world. So I've chosen to title my presentation "Why We Need Emotional Responses to the Climate Crisis." And I think it follows quite nicely from some of the things that Zoe said. But just two words here, a couple of remarks about two of the words in the title. One is emotional. In the kind of debates that I participate in, there's quite a bit of a discussion about what to call things. Is it emotion? Is it affect? Is it passion? Or what is it? Now, emotion would then be something that is more cognitive, and affect would be something that's more brute, and passion would be something that is always given from the outside, and not something that is generated by oneself. And I think we have an interesting discussion about this, but I also like use these terms a bit interchangeably as we go along. The why indicates what it means to be working from a political theory perspective, because the why is, of course, both an analytical why. What is it that's going on? Trying to understand what it is about emotional responses to the climate crisis that are important, but also a why that's normative. What is it then we ought to do if we know what we know? And I will also oscillate between those two in my presentation. So I think the first thing we could ask ourselves is actually building on what Zoe said. Why is it so difficult to talk about emotions in climate politics? Why is it that when people try to argue and to participate in political debates, that if they get emotional, they tend to be discarded, or at least pictured as somebody who is without real rationality and reason. And I think it actually goes to the very heart of the way in which we have structured over the several last centuries the terms and the structure of our political discourse. So an important element in political discourse today is the ability to distinguish between public and private. The distinction became particularly important around the breakthrough of modernity, early modern times, 1500, 1600, and 1700, where we got this idea of a liberal representative democracy in which one could act in common when one was in public, but then in private could do whatever one liked to do within certain limits. And that was a way of managing conflict and order by telling people to be individual in their private homes or in their private associations, and then follow some minimal but nonetheless quite important rules in public. Alongside that distinction then came another distinction, which was that we increasingly came to think of mind and body as two separate faculties, two separate domains, and that the mind was somehow superior to the body and therefore also more important than the body. One only has to read Descartes and others all the way up through Kant and modern philosophy to see that that element has been quite important in structuring our political discourse. And also that these terms then were coded gender-wise, so that the public and the mind was coded as something that was associated with the masculine, and the private and the body was associated with the feminine. And finally also that then to be masculine and mindful and public was a sign of matureness, and the other aspects were understood as signs of being immature. And I think these four, there are probably more dualisms, are structuring a lot of our political discourses even today, and is therefore also a sign of why it is so difficult to talk about emotions in climate politics. And if one is doubting that, you should only remind yourself of the debate around Greta Thunberg's now famous speech at the UN in 2019, the How Dare You speech, in which she was quite emotional in her critique of world leaders and of global politics in general. The backlash against this was enormous, and all of it was something having to do with you're being too emotional, you're being too feminine, you're being too immature, and you're not talking the language that you should talk in order to advance a serious argument. And to me, that is just a small example, but I think a quite illustrative example of how deep this structure of political discourse is, and therefore also how difficult it can be to talk about emotions in climate politics. The next thing you might then ask yourself is, well, why is it then a problem not to talk about emotions in climate politics? And I think it is a problem, and I think it produces the opposite effects of what we want. Again, following on what Zoe said. When we are talking about how to organize social movements, how to advance democratic politics, and how to inspire and nurture progressive climate action. And I think you can sort of like, as I was thinking about this and drawing on some of my previous work, I think that we can point to two arguments. One, I imagine, is quite obvious for most of you in this room, and another one which is a bit closer to my own field. The first argument is you could call it a phenomenological, neurological argument, that there simply is no mind-body dualism the way we have imagined it in Western philosophy. And I say that it is probably obvious to you, but in political science and the social sciences, we have built a long tradition of thinking that there was this dualism and not really taking into account things that neuroscience and other traditions of scholarship, psychology and so forth has come up with, which is here at Varela and others, Damasio could be another one, Joseph Ledoux could be a third one. This idea of an embodied mind as reminding us that anything we do is linked, anything we think is linked to our emotional states and our emotional responses to the world. It's taken a long time. I think it's only within the last 5 or 10 years that this argument has become accepted within social science and the way in which we discuss the terms of political discourse. The other argument, which are probably even more relevant to our conversation today, is that there is also a democratic political problem by not letting emotions into discourses around climate politics. We can say that because these emotions are always present, by disavowing them, by relegating them to the unexamined background, we get one of two effects. We get disempowerment, and overly rational discourse tends to produce technocracy and apathy on behalf of more ordinary citizens. And there gets to be a disconnect between what we know and how we act. And I think it's quite clear when you look at even Danish climate politics today, you sometimes hear this discourse. We know what we need to do, and we just need to act. And the disconnect is precisely the reliance on as it were, quote unquote, rational knowledge, not connected to emotional attachments and affective experiences. The other problem is that once then emotions are let in, they tend to produce extremism. And just to go along with the Greta Thunberg example, you could say that the moment American politics sort of like broke down its presumed rationality, its liberal discourse, what you get is then a quite aggressive, militant, violent type of public discourse where emotions are present, but they are present in this very, very non-progressive manner here represented by Donald Trump. So if we're interested in change and if we're interested in action, it is a problem that we are not able within our political discourse to talk about emotions in climate politics. So what to do about it? And this is where we sort of like shift the terrain from a more analytical terrain to a more normative one. So what is it then that we can say about emotional responses to the climate crisis? What could we wish for? What could we hope for when it comes to the structure of political discourse? And just sort of like as a way of summing some of these ideas up, 3 proposals, as it were. First of all, and I think this follows quite nicely from what I've already said, obviously from what I've said, that is expand the terms of political discourse. We really, when we talk about this issue, we're not talking about some minor adjustment in the way we talk about climate politics. We talk about a very fundamental way in which we need to change the terms and structure of political discourse. Here I call it expand. It's not that I want to advocate that we should leave aside science and expert knowledge, but maybe we could say that we need to recognize that even numbers and statistics are imbued with affective meaning, imbued with some kind of emotion that informs the way in which we process, the way in which we communicate, the way in which we act upon the type of knowledge that we get. And so there's some work here to be done in terms of basically shifting our understanding of what a good argument is. Also following along from what Zoe said, I think I've said here, like embed anger and anxiety and frustration within an effective assemblage of care, cheerfulness, and joy. And the thinking here is, I think, not completely contrary to what Zoe said, namely that anger is important and anger can be mobilizing and empowering. But it does also have some limits to it that we need to recognize. It is as an affect, it is an intense, but also quite exhaustive affect to have. And so there can be this danger of anger then, rather than going towards the activation dimension, going more towards the deactivation. And it can, in that sense, over time, not be a very sustainable affect. It can also be an affect that's quite empowering, as we talked about, but also an affect that can be antagonistic, and therefore, from a democratic point of view, produce unintended effects and not creating the kind of alliances that are needed for progressive climate action. And so within this type of thinking, other affects are needed. The anger needs to be converted into a care for the world. It can be managed, it can be a source of community through more positive affects and emotions, such as cheerfulness and joy. There's a whole tradition here, going back to at least Spinoza and others, that I think is important to have in mind as we talk about this. And then finally, and I think this is sort of like the political, proper political element, is that we need to be better at institutionalizing the exchange of embodied experiences. We need to allow these ordinary experiences to filter into public discourse and inform the way in which we talk about climate politics and the way in which we organize climate politics. So in my work, I've been interested in coming up with ways of thinking about bottom-up decision-making procedures, actually further democratizing, as it were, climate politics, in order also to let these experiences and responses be part of the conversation, and in that sense, inspire action. We know from the study of mini-publics and various kinds of citizen assemblies that the more ordinary people are involved in the debate, the more that they meet the expert knowledge with their own experiences that are quite emotional and quite affective, something happens and they start to change behavior in a much more radical way than we could have imagined before. So with that, I think I wanna stop and just say thank you for your attention. If some of what I've said here builds on some of the books that are published, one on what I call a sensory orientation to politics, and a more recent book that deals more direct with climate change. It's published in Danish, but I'm hoping that will come out in English before too long. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Lars. And again, feel free to unmute yourselves and give our second speaker an applaud. All right. Last but not least, we have Katherine. And since you were introduced as well, I guess I'll just give the word to you directly.
Super. Let me see if I can get this share and okay. I'm a little unsure what I'm doing here, to be perfectly honest. It seems to me that important things do elicit emotion. And so it would be absolutely wrong if climate change didn't elicit emotion. And I agree with Lars that it would be better if we could show emotion more in our political processes and so on. I have a theory that has to do with the gender distribution that we've traditionally had in our political systems, but we'll leave that discussion for another time. I was offended, though, by the assumption in this meeting that that it was negative emotions that we're talking about, and that climate should be eliciting negative emotions. Partly because I also question, as Lars did, whether or not negative emotions really do lead to the kind of action that we need. But also because I'm not, and I don't feel negative emotions. And in fact, I'll get into what I feel in a minute, but I think maybe the difference between what I feel and other people, that Zoey was in on it, because she talked about what climate imagery makes people feel. And I can easily see climate imagery eliciting negative emotions, but I don't take my understanding of climate change from climate imagery. And so that's maybe why I have a little different take on it. I think we are living in one of the most, possibly the most exciting time in the history of humankind. I think this picture that I'm showing you here, that I know you've seen before because I've been told it's the most downloaded from the net, started changing the way that humankind, and that's all of us, started thinking about our relationship with the rest of the planet. That is to say, the planet itself and other living organisms. And we're not finished with that travel yet. I like to think of it as a sort of a normal distribution. And 20 years ago, the cutting edge of this normal distribution was talking about climate change, but other people weren't. 10 years ago, the cutting edge was talking about planetary boundaries. Now the cutting edge is talking about systemic transformation. Meanwhile, while the cutting edge was moving, the top of the curve was being pulled with it. And the top of the curve, at least in Denmark, and I think many other places, has arrived at climate. But that's not the end of the road in this. So I think we're living in a time of a period of tremendous change. And I think many of the negative emotions that we're referring to are actually coming from a fear of change. But I also, as I say, find it to be a very exciting time. And I was, excitement was on the positive side of those emotions when Zoey showed us that circle with all the different emotions. I'm pretty sure that our ancestors, when they first stopped running after their food and settled at a fixed address, that they let their waste products fall wherever they were produced, and they took whatever they thought they needed from nature, whether it was game to eat or something to burn to get energy. And then they realized, as they got to be more, that wasn't going to work. The water was getting polluted from their own bodily waste. They were running out of game. They were going to have to manage their relationship to the rest of nature around them. I'm sure there were some people that became anxious about this because it was a change. It was something that was different. Nevertheless, society did band together and learn to manage its relationship to the local environment. We didn't solve that problem. We keep talking about solving climate change. We didn't solve that problem, but we learned to manage our relationship and our feedbacks in the system. When we got to be more, we realized that we also needed to do that regionally, because if we want clean air and water in Denmark, we can't let the Germans and the Poles and the Swedes throw all their rubbish into the air and the water. And what climate change and biodiversity loss, and I have to say, I think the biodiversity crisis is more important than the climate crisis. If we play our cards right and do get control of our emissions, then we will go back, or the Earth will go back to a climate system that doesn't have the fingerprint of humanity on it. But every single time we lose an organism, we can never get it back. So we can never go back to a biosphere that doesn't have the human footprint on it. But what climate change and the biodiversity crisis are telling us is that just like our ancestors learned they had to manage their relationship with the planet, with local environment, we need to manage our relationship with the Earth as a whole at the global level. Now, this is a real challenge because we don't have and we don't want a global governance. And so we're madly trying to develop mechanisms to be able to do so. But there's actually very good news out there. I mean, science now understands that the Earth behaves as a system. And we humans are a part of that system, and our activities influence the state of the Earth at the global level. Now, we've known for a long time that in an ecosystem, if you have a lake, for example, that's clear and it has plants growing in the bottom, that if you add nutrients to the lake, the water gets all murky, the light doesn't get to the bottom, the plants die. And even if you remove the nutrients, they don't come back. You've had a state change in that ecosystem. Now, those nutrients can come either from completely natural activities or from human. Until very, very recently, it was only things from outside, a meteor that crashed into the Earth and took the dinosaurs 63 million years ago, that could change the state of the Earth system. And now we're recognizing that we have the potential and the power to change the system. And there's a growing societal appreciation of this fact. Just merely the fact that we go around calling this time the Anthropocene. I mean, the Anthropocene, that is the age of man. Man is a quasi-geological force on this planet. We're also beginning to see political acknowledgement of the fact that we humans are a part of the Earth system. And here, I think, is the best example. We've had that picture I showed you on the very first slide. We've had that picture since 1972 and the Apollo missions. And what that picture shows very clearly is that our resources, the Earth's resources, they're not ours, but the Earth's resources are limited. And once we've used them, we're not going to get any more. But despite the fact that we've known that since 1972, it wasn't until 2015 that we got a global convention or agreement that acknowledges the fact that there is these resources. The resources we have available for our development are limited. And so the SDGs are a vision for how we want to share the Earth's resources. It's incredibly good news that we got something like that. And it would be impossible today, I think. The stars were aligned in 2015, and it's got amazing traction in society. And one of the mistakes we make in terms of the SDGs is to think it's about the individual goals. But in fact, there's nothing new on that list. We knew well before 2015 we had challenges in all of those boxes. And we had UN agreements on water, on women, on climate, on biodiversity, on peace, and I could continue. So what's really interesting is that we brought them into a single framework, and then it becomes the interactions, yes, the system that we're a part of that becomes really interesting. So there is progress and there is a lot going on. And I think all the legislation the legal cases in the past week or two, there have been 3 really huge legal cases for climate that, there is progress. There is real progress where Shell is forced to reduce, and Exxon got people kicked out of their board. And if the country, there's been an incredible increase in ambition from countries. They haven't done it, but they're stating higher ambitions. And if they do, we'd be down to 2.2 rather than 0.2 degrees if they really do live up to what they're doing there. So I think there's every reason for emotion, but they don't necessarily have to be negative emotions. Yes, I'm scared stiff. I think we have our back to the wall and a knife to our throats, but I work best under pressure, and I'm assuming that the rest of the world does as well. So I think we're living in in a period of change, but a period where there's room for massive optimism. And I get very frustrated when the assumption has to be that it's negative emotions that we're bringing to the table here. I wouldn't be able to work as hard as I do for this if I was totally negative. And when we understand the interactions between the SDGs, then we can see, okay, everything about giving us a better life comes with a cost at climate and biodiversity. And those are the proxies for the Earth's resources. And the trend here is negative. So we're getting farther and farther away from these goals for every day that goes. And we know that you can continue to party even if your bank account, the balance on your bank account is going down, but you can't do it forever. And that's exactly the situation we're in at the moment. And I hear increasing, it's politicians that are saying it, it's business people that are saying it, it's scientists that are saying it, and it's people that are saying it. No, we're not at the goal yet, but I think there's a lot of room for positive emotion. And we have a lot of tools at our disposal to be able to release the pressure and to ensure that human well-being is done with a lesser demand on the resources. Now, a lot of people think technology will do it on its own. It won't, and it's important that we continue to talk about this. It's a very dangerous narrative coming out now that we don't have to do anything. Technology is going to solve it all for us. But in fact, if you think about it, 15 years ago in the EU, they said, oh, we're polluting too much with our private cars. We need cars that go farther per liter. And so technology came in and made more sustainable cars that were better for the climate. But then we put the price down on cars, which changed our behavior. So now we're influencing climate even more with our private cars than we were before. So we have to learn to use these tools together and to accept the fact that we are a part of I should very quickly say that we are part of a system, and what we need to be doing here is to reduce the amount we're taking out of biodiversity and so on, and the waste we're putting in. And these 3 black arrows, that's climate. All of the other black and green arrows are just as important as climate. So we need to manage our relationship with the rest of the planet. So I'm actually, as I say, got our backs to the wall and a knife to our throat, but I believe that knowledge empowers. And therefore, I'm full of optimism when we know how the system works, and we know how to manage our relationship with the planet. And we're in the process of doing it, but it's a big job when we don't have a global government.
Thank you, Katherine. I think we as well should unmute ourselves and give her an applause as well. Thank you so much. I would very much like everyone who have a question to put an X in the chat or to put up your hand with the reaction field in the Zoom. And I think we will try to take the questions chronological. And I believe it began in the chat. So Marta with TH asked a question or has some comments. And I don't know, Marta, if you would like to ask it yourself here or if I should read it out loud. Okay, I'm gonna take that as I can just read it out loud. But her comment was that it was to Zoe's talk. And she was, sorry, Martha, I didn't know you were on your mobile phone. All right, maybe we should just move ahead then. Kimberly, I think you are here and you have a question. Do you want to ask it yourself to Zoe or should I read it out loud?
Yes, sure, I can ask it. Thank you. Kim Nicholas from Luxus at Lund University. Thank you for a really stimulating seminar. Zoe, I wanted to ask you for your thoughts and reflections on an appropriate target or targets of anger, if your research can speak to that at all. Because, for example, you might have seen this paper by Richard Heedy and Dario Canberra, I think, that came out, it's in press now, that lists the names of individuals, the 20 CEOs of the major oil companies and how much money they made from salary and from dividends, and assigns emissions responsibility to them, for example. There's also been lots of research on the role of large oil companies for many years. So those are sort of potential targets, as well as high emitters, either by country or by individuals. So just love to hear your thoughts on what is constructive and sort of fits with your advice of not getting angry at your neighbor, but where are the appropriate targets of anger? Thank you.
Thanks, Kimberly. That's a really insightful question. And one of the first conclusions we came to from that particular research is that no, our research can't speak to that, because we were left with that question of each of these discrete emotions, obviously the object of what that emotion is targeted to, we assumed would be different for, you're not going to be angry at biodiversity, you're not going to be angry at climate change itself. You might be depressed about climate change, but anger, looking at some of the more qualitative work that's been done on this, is usually human directed. So the object of the emotion is human. With anxiety, it might be, grief and solastalgia and things like that is something else again. Target would be, sorry if my internet cuts out here.
Perhaps Zoe. Sorry, Zoe, I was just wanting to suggest, since you have internet issues, to try to turn off your camera and then continue, because sometimes that helps.
Democratic countries, at least, are elected the conduit between ourselves and the business world. Well-intentioned anger, if you like. I wouldn't at all condone any sort of vigilantism towards the business world. I think it's a really interesting empirical question as well, how the different emotions are related to the different targets of those emotions as well. And it's something
I'm not sure if we lost Zoe right there. I think we did. Well, I'm terribly sorry about that. She wrote me while Katherine was giving her talk that her internet was suddenly unstable, and it usually isn't. So maybe we'll just thank Zoe for now, and then we can go to Lou, who also had a question in the chat. One for Zoe, but also one for Lars. So maybe Lou, if you're up for it, you could ask your question to Lars, and then we can get back to Zoe after that, if her internet is with us.
Yes, thank you. And I'm here from Copenhagen, University of Copenhagen. And I'm especially interested in mental health among young people. And my question to Lars was about this dichotomy of the public, the mind, the masculine, the mature, and the private, the bodily, the feminine, the immature. Because it seems to me that sometimes it is not really that black and white, and it really depends on who is angry. And it seems that it's also evidence-based that men, especially mature men, have more right to be angry than young women. So I'm thinking, is there a gender issue there that you have recognized when analyzing policy and politics? That was my first question to you, and thank you for your presentation.
Thanks, Lou. That's a very good question, and the short answer is yes. But maybe I can elaborate a little bit on it. So first of all, I think a lot of the reason why, especially today, or at least in the last, up until the last recent years, has been so difficult to talk about emotions because of you mentioned here, the Hitler experience. I think that has been so, like, at least within democratic thinking, been a sort of like an important moment for thinking about how to behave democratically. And precisely that, what the problem with Hitler and problem with fascism in general was that it was emotional and therefore also manipulative, and it produced this kind of mass mobilization that was irrational. And the reaction to that, particularly in German thinking, but also I think more generally in Western European and American thinking, has then been, we need to pull out everything that is emotional, and so, like, in our models of thinking about democracy, take that out so that we get this reasonable, rational discourse that collects everyone and that is moderate and that avoids these fascistic outbursts that we experienced during World War II, with everything that followed with that and horrible things. And that makes good sense in light of that. My point has been, the first point I wanted to make was that it is nonetheless counterproductive, and that it produces also the opportunity for new outbursts of affect to come about. And in that light, I think you're absolutely right that if now I had 4 dimensions, and you could a little bit, as a caricature, say that if you score high on 3, you have a bit of an allowance on the 4th. And I think that's exactly what you see when it comes to male anger vis-a-vis more female anger, that male anger, after all, is more permissible than female anger. And it is because men are supposed, so like the masculine is linked to something that nonetheless has some kind of reason with it, and that is allowed in public. It might also be sort of then turned into this kind of like militant warrior type of person who fights for the good cause and becomes a more heroic character. And that identity is much harder to access from a female perspective than from the masculine perspective. So I think that's, you're right, that and that's also, I think, why this Greta Thunberg speech went the way it went, was that she did not have access within the structure of political discourse to use the kind of rhetorical tools that she used in her speech. And then she was dismissed because of that. But thanks for the question. I think it's a very important one. And I agree with, I think Katherine also said it, that it does have something to do with, of course, gender imbalances in climate politics more generally.
Thanks a lot, Lars. I also see that Kimberly has a question to Lars. Do you want to ask it, Kimberly, or should I read it out loud?
Thank you. That's okay. Lars, excuse me, Lars actually already answered in the chat, so I'm all set. Thanks for that reference, Lars.
Good, perfect. Reading the questions a bit fast, sorry, in the chat, trying to manage everything. I see that David is with us and he made an X in the chat. So you're next, David.
Thank you. David Miller, I'm in Copenhagen. Maybe for Katherine, we're talking about anxiety, anger, and action. And I want a little focus on action. The definition of action, because it seems to me within this whole, climate change, action is protesting and et cetera, or doing something to save energy or whatever. It seems to me it's obvious that there's too much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, right? Particularly CO2 and methane. There's very, very little action in terms of doing something about that. In other words, we use solar, we use wind, we have district heating, so we're saving or we're limiting our uses of fossil fuel by using this renewable energy. But in terms of keeping us under 1.5 degrees, et cetera, we have to do something. And I'm asking you because you are, if anyone in Denmark, tied, advisor to the politicians, et cetera. and not in Denmark, in the United States. Why isn't there more? I'm by the way, I should mention, I'm the CEO of a startup based on an invention from the Department of Chemistry, the University of Copenhagen, to eradicate methane, low concentration methane in agriculture and mining and biofuels. So I'm trying to actually do something. I'm turning my anxiety and anger into action. But why is there so little focus on actually doing something, even commercially or whatever, from let's say a political side about climate change, and it's more just discussions and we should do something rather than true action that makes a difference?
I think it's very clear. It's a question of there's financial or economic interests in this, and there's the timeline of politicians. I mean, it's not conducive to making transformation with the timeline that we have here. You're much better off actually in an autocratic state that can invest in the future. So I think it's clear why it's so difficult and why it's important that we not just sit back and expect that our politicians are going to solve this. I think it's absolutely critical that people take to the streets, and that people. I mean, we had a climate election in Denmark a couple of years ago that nobody saw coming, and it's because people said this is what we want. I think it's their. Whether it was their anxiety that got them going there, I don't know. But I mean, I think we have to get over thinking that our politicians are going to solve this. That this is something that, and businesses. I mean, actually, if you look at what businesses have said they're willing to do in those partnerships, it was pretty amazing. Some of them realize you really have to do something here. That the government hasn't acted on that either is another story. But that's why it's so important that we keep pushing. There's a podcast series coming out soon with two old ladies, myself and Connie Hillego, called The Impatience. And where we say we've had these solutions for a long time. Why is it that we're not able to get them going? And it keeps coming back to politicians. We have to keep pushing them.
Thank you so much, Katherine. Also, I want to write down the name of that podcast. When can we expect it being out?
I thought it was going to be out in the middle of May, so it should be any second now. And it's called Die Utålmodige. It is in Danish.
Yeah.
It's a series of 5.
Awesome. All right. I see that Kimberly after David had an X, but I don't know if Kimberly, you got all of your questions covered. If so, then let me know.
Yes, I did. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Then we have an X in the chat from Fernando.
Yeah, thanks to 3 speakers. It was a really interesting discussion. I think maybe this is following up on Katherine's comments that we can't expect politicians to enable action. And maybe it's a question for both Katherine and Lars. It's if we can't expect them to do action, what is it left for us to do? And maybe it's also related to what Lars was talking about, like sort of these bottom-up approaches to democracy. What are concrete examples of things that we can do, given that we can no longer expect politicians to do something?
I wasn't saying you can't expect them to do it, but I heard Christina Figueres, who was the chief negotiator for the UN at the Paris Congress, once say, solving climate change is like getting your lorry out of the mud. You can pull it, but you might lose track, you might lose control of the back end, or you can push it, but you don't necessarily know where you're going to get it. And I see this as being a real push-pull. And we had the Paris Agreement. That was a pretty political thing that made those goals. And then we've gone into a phase here where there's been very much push from businesses and from people and from I think this is so exciting what's happening in the law courts right now. So right now I think it's not the politicians that have the ball, but that's not the same thing as saying that when we we push and when we speak with our wallets in terms of our buying power and so on, that companies won't change and politicians won't change. So I see this as being just like a university. There's always this top-down, bottom-up discrepancy, and the balance isn't always the same, but it's not in the politicians' hands right now.
Yeah, I think I want to preface my answer by pointing to a scholar of literature, Timothy Morton, who in some of his works on climate change and nature has suggested that climate change is a kind of hyper object. And by that he means an object that is very, very difficult to fathom and to comprehend and to digest for human minds, or at least for the human mind. I'm not saying that that's true, but I think that's how a lot of people feel about it. And his point is that kind of experience can produce kind of like a breakdown of the ability to act and to orient oneself in the world. It feels very disoriented. And I'm also thinking here of the Apollo image that Katherine is using, which I think is a very important image, but it has that duality to it. On the one hand, it suggests a kind of look at this beautiful world, look at how amazing it is, look at all the resources, look at how we can take in the world in one piece. But of course also then a feeling of disconnectedness and of not really knowing where to go from there. And so I think that feeling is quite important, not so much for scientists and for maybe even for high-level politicians, but it is the case for a lot of ordinary citizens. And so the question is how to sort of like convert that overpowering experience to something that is meaningful and something that is actionable and something that you can belong to. And in that sense, also something that you can inspire action. And that's where I think, when we say we can't expect politicians, we are kind of like thinking of the politicians as somebody that is serving us. But we give them a mandate every 4 years and then they go away and they do their business and then we come back and meet 4 years later down the line. And that is, again, a quite disempowering approach to action. So how do we avoid those two things? I think we avoid it by taking climate change closer to ordinary experiences. And that means, for example, citizen assemblies. It means local initiatives. It means, a plurality of civil society engagements. Because that's where climate change becomes relatable and where it becomes meaningful for the people who have to take the change and have to make the change, who have to change their food patterns, who have to change their travel habits, who have to change all kinds of things. And until that happens, I think, as a way, we also get the politicians that we deserve. And those will be politicians who won't be as progressive when it comes to acting and enacting climate laws. So that's how I think about it. And so I don't think there's one magical tool in the toolbox, but what we see today is actually like a flourishing of initiatives at the grassroots level. And I think we should have more of that. And we should of course, be concerned about the effects of it, and we should try and study it as much as we can. I think we have very poor tools at the moment for that. But at least looking from where I'm sitting, it seems like a pretty good bet that the action is going to come from there rather than from the Treasury or some other, the climate ministry or something like that. They are still tied up in other kinds of logics that are counterproductive for what we are facing.
Thank you so much, Lars. And also thanks to you, Katherine. We have more or less 5 minutes left. I'm gonna send now Zoe's email in the chat in case you have questions you want to address to her. Feel free to email. And Rasmus, I see you made an X as well. Feel free to ask your question.
Yes, thank you. So I guess this is mostly directed at Katherine, although both Katherine and Lars just touched on it. So Katherine, you talked about the decade gaps between the cutting edge and general climate awareness. And then you talked about that the action, this climate action lies with the public and not the politicians. So I was thinking, is there anything we can do in science as informers to sort of move this bell curve and move this these decade gaps between climate awareness? Is there anything obvious we can do, considering that we're not supposed to be emotional and we're supposed to be, very bang on the topic?
Yeah, that's where I was going to go, Rasmus, with this. It's really interesting that very few natural scientists are societal debaters. I mean, you have a lot from statskundskab, or you have a lot from the social sciences and even from the humanities that are debate. That they take on the public discussion, but natural scientists don't tend to do that, and that's maybe because we are supposed to be divorcing feeling, even though we're people, and that's sort of a problem. Divorcing our science from emotion, and it is a tricky and hard road to hoe. But I keep saying communication, and I hold over 100 talks a year I was out at a little fund this morning, a fund that supports poor people in Denmark, about how and why this was important for them. I've been at folkedans, traditional dancing groups, and this isn't something that we get merit for on our CVs, but it's so important, I think, to have the dialogue and be a part of the dialogue, and to be willing to just settle every time. I mean, I can tell you exactly when the 8th grade in Denmark has project week, because every other one of them rings to me and wants to know something about climate, and I do it, stupid as I am, even though it doesn't give me any credit whatsoever in my science. But I think we have a responsibility to communicate what we know, and in a way that people can understand it, even though it doesn't give us any scientific kudos.
Thank you so much, Katherine. And great question, Rasmus. I see Thijs also has one.
Yeah, thank you very much. It has been extremely helpful and interesting. And I'm one of those scientists who don't say much in the public. But this is really interesting, and I think, Zoey, you gave us 3 we call it pieces of advice. One was get mad, one is to stay mad, and of course to keep them in check. So, and also showed that the anger was actually productive or for making collective action. So actually, I see that now the role for scientists like me is to stay mad and get other people upset about this reality. But is that right? Is that what I'm supposed to do? And then just expect that there'll be a lot of people who probably will might despair a little bit from having somebody.
Is it anger or passion we're looking for, Thijs?
Yeah, is it anger?
I have to supplement that. I don't know if Zoey is with us and if she can answer. Are you here?
I'm not sure if you can hear me, but
you can. Yay! It's go ahead and answer, Zoey.
But it's an interesting point. Is it anger or is it passion? And Katherine, I do get I do accept that it was necessarily, I guess, given the brief, erring on the negative side of emotions. But of course, and partly that's a disciplinary bias that we just concentrate on the deficit for the sake of all else. But I think it's important to realise that emotions aren't discrete, they co-occur, and negative emotions exist because of positive emotions in the first place. And the amount of joy and hope and wonder we get from the natural world and the understanding of the natural world in a way is necessary for us to feel those negative emotions as well, and vice versa. But on that point about is it anger or is it passion, is kind of a bit of both. I mean, people talk about pragmatic hope, you know, how do you get from ecological grief to pragmatic hope? And I think because, you know, they're overlapping Venn diagrams to some extent, these emotions as well. So, you know, being mad and staying mad, I don't mean that in a destructive way, but to kind of utilize those positive emotions that are attributable between, you know, our interconnectedness with the natural world as well. And scientists, natural scientists are uniquely placed to be able to, even if you don't feel like you can articulate that, a very kind of profound bit on emotions to do with climate change here in Australia was a guy that asked, how does climate change make you feel? And he went to 5 dozen climate scientists and got them to write letters in. And I was talking about these, you know, objects of care and how that links climate change to our emotions. And these climate scientists were enormously articulate in linking, you know, their analytical life to their emotional life. So I do think that scientists are uniquely positioned to be able to communicate what the natural world means to it and our embeddedness within it. So anger, but not so much so that it makes you inarticulate, I guess.
Thank you so much.
Constrained anger with passion.
Sounds good. I want to quickly say to those of you who have to leave right here, right now, feel free to do so. We are a bit above the time frame we set for this event. But if you do feel like staying a few minutes more, then please do stay, because I think it's important for us to wrap up quickly. I think we all agree on the 3 speakers were absolutely wonderful, brilliant. I enjoyed listening to all of you. And I think you each had very good take-home messages. And Thijs, you just summarized Zoe's, but I don't know if you, Zoe, want to add something to that. And then after that, I think we should give the word to Katherine and Lars so they could have the opportunity to do the same.
Not much more to add to that, Lisa, just to reiterate, thanks for inviting me here. I'm really excited when these interdisciplinary events happen. I think that's incredibly important as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks also for the invitation again. And it's been a very interesting and productive conversation that I've joined a lot. I don't have much to add, except for saying that I don't think we will see climate action without emotions. And so the question here is how we're gonna nourish, inspire, and empower emotions that are needed for the kind of challenges that we're facing.
I couldn't agree with Lars more. I mean, obviously we need emotions, and if things are important, they, as I said, I think important things elicit emotions, otherwise they wouldn't be important. So I was just maybe questioning how helpful anxiety is, and whether we need maybe passion or engagement in another way. I would also like to take the opportunity here, coming from the Sustainability Science Center, who's a co-host of this meeting, to suggest that you have a look at our website. We do have lots of different activities that can be relevant, and this isn't the first time we've talked about anxiety and moving mountains, because we do need to move some mountains. So thank you for having me here today.
I very much agree. We have a lot of work to do ahead of us, but hopefully we'll do it compassionate and emotional. So if anyone have any last remarks, then now's the time. Otherwise, we would just very much like to thank you all for joining, both you who are attending as audience and for our 3 amazing speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.